Alright guys, in the last lesson, you saw how we can handle simple events such as clicking on a button or hovering over it. Now in this lesson, I want to talk about some more complex events, such as the events that arise from within a form. Now, when you're creating web apps, it's pretty common that you're going to be creating forms for login, for registration, for contact, and there's some peculiarities. In order to really understand how forms work, we need to incorporate our knowledge about setting state and using state. So in this lesson, I want to tackle how you can get the user inputs from the input element and how you can use the submit button in order to use the information that the user has typed in. Just as we had the on-click event that we could add to our submit button, we also have an event on the input called onChange. And this is triggered every single time the value of the input changes. So when the user types something new inside. So we can create a function called handle change, which is going to be triggered every time the input is changed. Let's go ahead and log changed, and let's pass the name of this function over to our onChange. Now, when I start typing inside this input, namely changing it, you'll see that my handle change gets called every time I add a new letter. Now, this is not very useful because what we're more interested in is actually what the user has typed rather than the fact that they have started typing. The other thing to know is that when your input element triggers the function that's stored in the onChange, it also passes over an object. And that object corresponds to the event that triggered this onChange. And we can log various things related to that event. For example, we can log event.target.value. And remember that the event is the event which triggered the onChange, the target is the element that triggered this event, and the value or any of the other properties on the target are the things that correspond to the value of some of these attributes. For example, in addition to event.target.value, we can also get hold of the placeholder of the element that triggered the event or the type of the element that triggered the event. And if I hit save and start typing, you'll see that every time I enter a new letter, the first thing that gets printed is the value. The second is my placeholder. And the third is the type. And this happens every time I type a new letter. So let's get rid of these other two and focus on our event.target.value. If I start typing, you can see that every single time I type a new letter, handle change is being triggered, passing over the event that triggered the change, and I'm logging the current value, which corresponds to the text that exists in this particular input. Now, what if I wanted to use this value that the user has typed somewhere else inside my app or my component? Say if I wanted to change my hello, so instead of saying hello, it actually corresponds to what's being typed in the input. Well, to do that, I of course need to have state in my app. So let's go ahead and create a new constant, and then let's destructure our output of our useState to hold two things. One is going to be the name, and the second is going to be the function setName, which is going to help me update this name constant. And I'm going to set this to use state. And when I call this function, I'm going to provide a starting value, which is actually just going to be nothing, an empty string. And remember to add useState to the import when you're using this function. Now I can use this constant name inside my h1, and I'm going to add it right at the end after the hello. So opening up a set of curly braces, inserting the value of the variable name inside here at the end. And now what I'm going to do is whenever handle change gets called, I'm going to call setName, and I'm going to pass over the value of event.target.value. So now when I start writing, you can see that I'm updating the state of that name variable, and then it's being added to my h1 as I type. Now, there's just one thing to remember about forms. In HTML, the elements themselves are responsible for handling their own state. For example, you might remember that there's an attribute called value, and this corresponds to what is currently inside the input. Now, in HTML, this value is normally handled by the input property, and it sets it to whatever is being typed in here. But in React, what you should really do is set the value to the variable that comes from the event.target.value. In our case, that would of course be this thing name. This way, we have one single source of truth, which is the state of name. So whenever we use it inside other components, or when we have it as the value of the input, they're all corresponding to the same thing, and they're all going to match up. And this, in React lingo, is called a controlled component. And I highly recommend you to take a look at this link, which I'll add in the course resources, and have a brief read just of this paragraph where they talk about this concept of controlled components. And don't worry if you're seeing this documentation. In 2019, when I'm recording this, they're still showing class components, but in the future, hopefully they'll update this to show hooks instead. But the concept is the same. We have to add the value that comes from our state as the value attribute of our input, and keeping a single source of truth. And that's basically all there is to this idea of controlled components. Now, here's a challenge for you. What if I wanted to be able to type in a name, and then only when I click on the submit button does it get added to my H1? See if you can use what you've learned in this lesson and the last lesson to complete this challenge. Just as a hint, you're going to need to detect events in the submit button. You're probably going to need another variable to keep track of state, and you might have to also have a mess around with your code until you can get it to work. Pause the video now, give it a go, and then come back and we'll walk through the answer together. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we're probably going to need to add a on-click listener to our submit button. And when this button gets clicked, we're going to trigger a function, which I'll call handle click. Now, handle click doesn't need to look at the event data. It doesn't really care. It just needs to be triggered when the user presses on this button. So that's what we're going to pass in here, handle click. And when that button is clicked, what do we want to happen? Well, it's only in that moment when we want to take the value of the event.target.value that came from the input and then put it inside the H1. So instead of using the name variable, which is always going to be updated as we change the value of this input, instead, maybe we can use a different variable. Maybe we can call it heading text. And we can keep track of the state of heading text by using our useState hook. And we'll have another method called setHeading, and we'll set that equal to useState, and the initial value is also going to be an empty string. We don't want anything to show up after the word hello. But when the submit button is clicked and we want to handle that click, well, then we want to set our heading to the value of our name. So we're using this name variable and setting it as the heading text. So a quick note here is that when you're writing a function, you can simply just use the name of the variable. You don't need the curly braces around it. And in fact, if you do add the curly braces, then you're going to set your heading text to be a JavaScript object rather than just a value, like so. So that's a thing to be careful about. And if in doubt, you can always use the log statement to log what curly braces name looks like, which is an object versus what just the name property is, which is just the actual value. Once we've set the heading, then the value of name at this moment in time is going to become the heading text. And then the heading text should display in our H1. And if we check it out and click submit, then you can see this is how it's meant to work. Did you manage to get it right? If not, head back to your code and see if you can fix it and get it to work. Now, the very last thing I want to show you regarding forms is normally we're used to putting our inputs and our submit buttons inside an HTML form component. And so it would look something like this. And maybe you would have the button type being set to submit, so that if you had multiple buttons, it's only this one that would trigger the submission of the form. But even if I didn't have this type submit, notice what happens when I have a button inside a form component and I click on it. So if I go ahead and type my name in here, I'm expecting it to show up in the H1. But if I click on submit right now, see how it added it to the H1, but then it quickly refreshed the app. And this is the default behavior of form components in HTML. They refresh in order to submit, make a post request or make a get request, and refreshes the page. And what happens is when you click on the button inside the form, especially if this is the submit button, then it actually triggers a method on the form called onSubmit. So you can, in fact, set this to the handler or whatever it is you decide to do when that button gets clicked. And this has the same effect. When the button gets clicked inside the form, it triggers the onSubmit of the form and calls the function that you have designated. So now we haven't actually improved anything. It still refreshes, but we can now address it inside the handle click function. So we know that we get an event passed whenever one of these event handlers get triggered. So we can catch that event inside this function. And right at the end of the function, once we've done everything it is that we want to do, we can get the event to call prevent default. And this is a method that basically prevents the default next behavior of the event, which in our case, if it's coming from the forms on click to here, that is going to be refreshing the page. So now if I go ahead and type in my name and click submit, you'll notice that it gets added to the heading without the default behavior of the submission. So that's just a quick note that comes in really handy when you're working with forms in React. In the next lesson, I want to take you on a brief tour and compare using classes versus hooks to manage state. We saw classes being mentioned in the React documentation, so I want to demystify the concept and talk about why React is moving to hooks instead. And after that, we're going to learn how to manage more complex states, including how to save JavaScript objects using the useState hook. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.